JB, we're blessed here on In the Huddle for the 12th straight year. This is 12th season, 12th year. We're doing this special thing here, speaking with the NCAA Selection Committee Chairman about the bracket that is released now here. We saw the NCAA.com reveal, and we want to talk to him about how we arrived at where we are at. I will let you do the honors, sir.
Well, he's done with his 2-year term now, Frank, so we can go refer to him as the head coach of Lake Forest College, the Foresters. But we're very pleased for the second year in a row to have Jim Catanzaro on the show. Coach, welcome back to In the Huddle, and how are things in Indy?
They're chilly, but they're feeding me well, so that's okay. They found the way to my heart is to make sure I have food whenever I'm sitting down.
That matters.
That's the beauty of the Midwest, baby.
Yeah. As an Italian, I concur 100% with the food part. Coach, we want to talk to you, obviously, about a plethora of issues here, but we have a limited amount of time, so we want to jump right on in here. The first thing that a lot of people notice are the ones, the twos, all that stuff. But let's talk about first how much sleep you got last night. I think that's an important thing. When Wisconsin Whitewater lost, what did that do to your guys' night, basically?
Well, the first thing was we couldn't have the West Region ranking call until after that game. And so we chose not to operate on a what-if mindset. We wanted to see how numbers worked out and things like that. And so the West Region call went off at about 9 o'clock Central Time. So being in Indianapolis, being on East Coast time, that got done probably around 10:45, got their votes in. Then we kind of went about the selection of the 5 at-large teams and then put together our first look at the bracket and got done with that about 1:30, 1:45, and then decided to take a 6-hour break and come back and work on it again this morning.
And work on it you did. Let me ask you. Let me ask you. So I bring up the ones and the twos before that question, but the ones and twos matter because obviously we've heard historically, at least, that those are the 8 teams, the 4 ones, the 4 2 seeds that you try to achieve. Ascertaining and treating the best way possible. In philosophies that we've heard before, the best one should be going against the worst 2, and then you build pods around them. Were you able to achieve that? And can we assume that Mary Hardin, Baylor, Salisbury, Mount Union, and Wheaton were the ones, and then Wisconsin Whitewater, Muhlenberg, Wesley, and Chapman were the 2s based on that kind of philosophy? Walk us through what you can in that respect.
Yeah, the things I can say is that the geography once again played a bit of a relevant part. You had a team in Chapman who was 10-0, but is obviously out in the island, and then you have Mary Hardin Baylor who's on an island, and so they may not be the true natural 1s and 2s, but they were more of a with the geography and things like that. I think that there are a few teams when you look at a school like Salisbury was definitely helped by the chaos in the Wisconsin Conference last night, and probably got themselves what would look to be, from that perspective, a 1. But really, it's going to be more of a there are kind of, I don't know that we say best 1s or 2s because I think at this point the 1s and 2s for everybody are pretty darn good.
Yeah, one of the things as far as us being East Region guys, Coach, it looked like initially we were kind of scratching our heads at the placement of Union taking on Case Western, but I guess when you kind of do the math mileage wise, comparing and say let's say Western New England, who we thought Union would be quote unquote above in the rankings, you're over 500 miles there. I think if you're going from Cleveland, Ohio, straight to Springfield, Massachusetts. So, I know in the past you've talked about how you guys do the best to kind of work within the system. Were there any other matchups like that where the mileage just made things a little more tricky?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of them. The Redlands is a 3rd-ranked team in the West, and they're flying out to play a number 1 team, and of course that's the island issue. Yeah. There was some lacking in the middle of America, if you will. The Ohio population that we've had in the past, where you've had the centers and the John Carrolls and some other schools that could maybe get to you from Kentucky or Ohio and really give some flexibility to the bracket. There wasn't as much flexibility available this year as we'd had in previous years. There were a number of teams that we would put up on the screen and you'd hover over them, which tells us how many miles they are from other opponents. You'd be like, they can't go to either their first or their second round game, and you're not going to be able to get those flights out of the NCAA at that point.
Coach, we are an East Region show technically here, so we're going to focus on these for another question or two probably. And there is what we would call, again, an East-centric type bracket, although a couple of exceptions do pop up here, obviously. Looking in the upper right with Salisbury at the head of it, and James kind of pointed out some of the anomalies there with Case Western Reserve being brought in and Muhlenberg being brought in. Delaware Valley last year, ironically, got sent out and had to face Muhlenberg in another, let's say, regions bracket, even though we don't use pure regional brackets anymore. I get that, but there are certain centers that we do see drawn in these things. Was there a need to or desire to achieve the East as kind of a central zone? Because the NCAA or your selection committee, not necessarily yours personally, but the selection committees of years gone by, have taken it on the chin for sort of letting the East go at it itself. And some people have thought of those to be the easiest bracket historically. What would you say to how you treated the East in these situations?
Well, I think the East this year, and it's really kind of almost two brackets, because if you take a peek at the bottom quadrant of the Mount Union bracket, if you will, you've got a 4-pack of teams down there as well. So trying to really get some cross-region matchups where there is that opportunity is something we always try to do. And you see that with really just about every bracket we have, there's at least 2 regions represented in it, and trying to get as many as we can. The Northeast, what really happens is where the AQs are, there's so many AQs within there for conferences that it's just really hard to find that mileage that works in that first round, and even in the second round, trying to make that work without having to set up a flight. And so it's they may be able to get to one school, but can they get to another in round 2? And that, I think, is probably the harder part. Those southern schools that are located in Pennsylvania, you can tell me Pennsylvania's the South, but living in New York, that's not that far south.
I'm with you, right? I'm with you there, Coach. And speaking of the 4-pack down in the lower right, I mean, one of the things that sort of obviously jumps out, and all due respect to the Eagles fans, I mean, they'll be favored as the home team with Del Val coming in as the MAC champion. But the possibility of that Wesley Del Val rematch, was a great game the first time, went to 4 overtimes. Was there any back and forth on the committee of like sort of the risk of having that rematch, or is this one of those things where just from the pod and the geographic distances and so on, that just made sense to keep those teams kind of in the same spot?
Yeah, it was more of a made sense. There are some other opportunities for those second round rematches in some of the other brackets as well. But I think that we didn't want to intentionally do that. But I do think that that's what kind of, just by the nature of there only being 32 teams, there's a lot of teams that played each other this year. So I think it wasn't intentional. It was kind of just a natural fit where the geography went, and Wesley being the 2 seed out of their region, and the RAC, I thought that was, when you look at it, they kind of fit where they kind of belong. They fit as a number 2. Their one loss was to the top ranked team. So I think they kind of probably landed where they needed to.
I'm assuming that the regional rankings, the final regional rankings, are again going to be released by the NCAA at some point tonight or tomorrow morning. We've seen historically, so we will be able to determine who is on the table, Pool C wise, at that point. To the degree you want to tell us, you feel free to, though. But I guess the Wisconsin Whitewater situation created a lot of chaos in a lot of different ways. Pool C, obviously, because they got picked. But a team like John Carroll is not on this list. And there is a group in America that wants to say, that's a D3 fan based group that says, hey, John Carroll deserves it because aside from losing to Mount Union, they went undefeated against a good batch of teams. And then there's another group out there that says, John Carroll, who do you play? Really, at the end of the day, that whole conference looks good because of Mount Union. When you guys took a look at a team like John Carroll and the OAC generally, I guess my question becomes, why not John Carroll for what people out there that kind of rooted to see them in there would ask you right now?
Well, I think there's 2 parts of that question I want to answer. Were the when there was 3 teams from the South region last year, were the South region people asking why there was not a second team from another region as an at-large. But for John Carroll in particular, it's really about what time they get on the board. And I think that when the RAC puts their numbers together, that first team has to get off the board before the second team can go, and then before the third team can go, the second team has to go. And once the final rankings come out, I do think that there's a case that if you want to make that argument, it had to be made probably in the previous weeks or in the current week of where did they belong in the regional rankings, and did their numbers set that? Because every year it's about the numbers to an extent, but we are not just a robotic number spitting group. Otherwise, they wouldn't need a committee to look at it. And I think that some of the things that changed this past week really helped certain teams and hurt some other teams. And I mean, obviously the Whitewater going into Pool C really mucked it up for a lot of teams, because that was one of those 5, desired at large bids that was no longer available. That was really kind of, you look at their numbers with a 570, plus strength of schedule and who their losses were and who some of their wins were, and they would have been a hard team to keep out almost any year that I've followed Division III football.
Yeah, speaking of strength of schedule, Coach, it seemed like in the first kind of mock rankings that it really wasn't utilized. It was more about win-loss percentage, and then the formulas started to come into play. Were there any situations where, say, the last game of the season had an impact on a strength of schedule, positive or negative, that could have swayed things? I mean, it seemed part of maybe what was a challenging situation for John Carroll was that there was just some pretty strong both Western and North region teams. And obviously, Wesley got in from the East, and that was it. At the end of the day, it's just there's only so many bids to go around for 9-1 teams, and it just kind of comes down to the metrics to a certain extent. But I know in the past you've talked about that 15 to 20% sort of the human element. Maybe it's the eye test to that effect. How did that play into the decision making process with the 5 Pool C bids?
Yeah, I think a couple of games that played into some things were when it knocked teams off the regional rankings, teams that took losses. You look at a team like Bethel, you look at a team like Baldwin-Wallace, Wabash taking another loss to be dropped out of the rankings. That really impacted, some of the regional rankings and those results, because it brought other teams either back into the mix that had been gone for a week, or brought in new teams completely. And, one of the things I think really stands out is when you look at some of those teams that really gave their case for where they were to be a little bit stronger than maybe the others. And again, there still is only 5 at-larges. And if the strength of schedule is not real strong, it's hard to give yourself credit. If you don't have regionally ranked wins on top of a strong strength of schedule, you really need to have both of those components to give yourself an advantage if you do the blind eye test.
And one quick follow-up, Coach. One of the things you said back on the ATN podcast number 216, I did my homework actually, and I worked out today. I listened to that again to get the re-education from you. Was there a situation that came up with as the national committee chair? One of the things you mentioned was sometimes you have to go back to the RAC with a why to try to understand. Mm-hmm. As you describe in that podcast, you have coaches and people from 4 different regions, trying to get them all on the same page at a national level. Don't necessarily have to name names or anything, but were there any situations where you guys as a committee were like, yeah, let's take this back to the RAC to have them better explain where their thought process was, whether it had to do with the seeding, maybe a change, that kind of situation?
Not necessarily with the seeding, but I think we really pointed one RAC back to the criteria, and I think that's an important thing to always do. I know that even on the West Region RAC, which I serve on, I can speak to that phone call a little bit better. There's a lot of questions of, this team's a conference champion, this team's a runner-up. Why don't they go ahead of them in the rankings if they're both 9-1? And well, being a conference champion is not a criteria. So I think that at times we do have to kind of push back on all of our RACs to hold them accountable to the standards that we're governed with. So I do think that kind of happens each year in each region initially, and then you kind of see where it kind of lays out after the second ranking or after the mock rankings that we do, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And when you do that, it does kind of set the standard of, hey, if you're going to do this, you have to be consistent with it. And if you're going to apply it, say to John Carroll, you have to be willing to apply it to North Central or to Hope or to whoever else is in that grouping. If you're going to use it in one case, you can't then turn around and not use it for the other teams in that, particularly in that region. Maybe not to the national level, but at least to that region, it has to stay consistent.
We saw some interesting use of head-to-head over a couple of weeks, and I'm wondering if that didn't filter back in when we see the final regional rankings. We'll probably be able to ascertain that. One question, though, that has arisen, and it's more of a generic question, not to your specific bracket, but now that you're probably rolling off this committee in the near future, or at least as chair, I'm curious about your thoughts, and maybe to the degree you can tell us maybe some of the thoughts of others that you've been working with. SUNY Maritime is the first team since 2010 when St. Lawrence did it that is 5-5 going into the tournament, and congratulations to them for not being 4-6 and one of the ugliest box scores you'll ever see when they beat Mount St. Joseph yesterday. But that said, with now only 5 at-large bids and some of the chaos that we saw yesterday, is there a feeling that this system is maybe not? We know it's not perfect, but even less perfect than we used to think it was, especially with the lack of at-large bids now. And is anyone going to step forward that you can think of to maybe question whether or not we need to rethink certain aspects of this, be it the ratio, the teams need, the access ratio as they call it, the number of teams per conference needed, or going to some kind of earned access that Division II, for instance, uses? Is this going to be the process for the time to come, or is somebody going to try to do something about it?
Well, I find it funny that the two suggestions you just brought up are both like antithesis to one another. Increasing the access to, more teams, I think would be appealing to everybody, but nobody wants to be there on Christmas. And I think that that's one of the issues we're running into, is that the player safety issue of eliminating a bye week during the regular season would be pretty, I think there'd be a lot of opposition from coaches as far as that goes. And so we can't have one arm saying, hey, we need player safety, we need to give them rest and recovery, and then eliminate that only opportunity to do so. The elimination of the at-large bid, I don't think there's really any appetite for. The opinionation of who should go in and that type of thing, when you eliminate those automatic opportunities, I think that that's a really tough pill to swallow when you say, well, we think this team's better, so we're going to put them in. And unfortunately, I think that can sometimes happen. I was on a Division II staff that won a conference championship that we thought we should be in the tournament, and we weren't. And that I don't know that was a great feeling. So I do think that there's probably an appetite to expand it, but not really a good plan to how. I don't think the kind of just take the 32 best teams in the country type proposal is anything that's going to be what our tournament's about in Division III.
As always, we want to give you the final word, final thought, things you might change for the better as you kind of leave this post and, have experience now having done it for a couple of years. We don't have numeric podcasts here, so we can't refer back to this as ITH to whatever, but
I think we're over 250, Frank.
We are.
Maybe we should have had like a party or something like, woo.
Yeah. But
this is Selection Sunday with me number 2 is all we'll have to call this one. I'll know what it is.
I like that. Okay, and then we'll call next appearance Wu-Tang. But
right.
What would you change, or what would you suggest the NCAA or to your successor ultimately? And did you enjoy this process? Let's face it. You had to leave your team yesterday after they played an away game. So they go home. You don't get to spend time with your seniors on that bus trip home, which may be a blessing or a curse. I've never coached, so I can't say that for sure. But you had to go directly down to Indy. Was it worth doing this? And what would you tell the NCAA, your successors, et cetera, at this point?
It was definitely worth it for me from twofold. I've been pretty outspoken that I feel like coaches need to take more ownership into their sport, whether it's at the NCAA level or the AFCA level, whatever it might be. And when I found out that I was actually the first football coach to serve as the chair in the modern inclination, it was like, that's crazy to me that we've had this playoff for that long and not had a football coach, take the time to be the chair. Having said that, it does take time away from me preparing my team. And if I didn't have great assistant coaches, it would be, even harder to do that. There were some drawbacks being away from the team. There'll be a week of recruiting that I don't go do because I'll be in Shenandoah, things of that nature. But I do think that it was definitely worth it. I think that my input in, not just as the chair for the tournament, they brought me in for the Sports Science Institute and a few other things where I was able to give my input. And I think the next chair just has to really appreciate the variety of teams that we have in Division III and the true inability to evaluate certain things against one another, because we just don't ever have a new MAC team play a Midwest Conference team. And so until you get those guys playing, so you can't really say, and don't let history be your guide. Just because a team hasn't won a couple of playoff games because they played Mary Hardin-Ballard or Mount Union in the first round 2 out of the last 4 years doesn't mean that they're maybe not deserving of a home field game when they go 10-0 one year. I think those are some things we got to fight history a little bit, and not have our preconceived notions of the teams and try to evaluate them on the worth of that year, not their career and program. And sometimes we were able to do that, and other times maybe we weren't as successful doing that. So
You bring up a great point. I want to reach back here for a second.
those are my closing thoughts, Frank.
Oh, I'm sorry, Coach. But you know what? You brought up.
That's what you get for being on a show with a lawyer, Coach. Come on.
Yeah, see that. But you know what? Salisbury, Oshkosh. How good did it feel to be able to last night talk about a matchup you would never normally see between two completely different regions, the East and the West? I mean, did that help you guys talk about Salisbury and/or Oshkosh last night?
It definitely helped us talk about Salisbury. I'm not sure that it was the thing that stood out about Oshkosh was beating Whitewater, and so we always talk that wins are what are kind of the bigger criteria than the loss. Yeah. But I do think that having those two teams play against each other early in the season definitely helped, and it probably gave more credence to Salisbury, despite having a low SOS. Having that victory early in the year really helped them kind of cement themselves as a higher seed.
Fair enough, Coach. We do appreciate you a lot. I'm serious about having you back for the Framingham State interview later on this week, and we'll talk some Wu-Tang Clan, because I'm going to need somebody to help me on that one, guide that one, and it ain't going to be Mr. JB down below me here. But we look forward to seeing you in Shenandoah. I'm trying to convince JB to come down and have a little party with us down in Texas, and we'll see what happens in 5 weeks, basically. We'll see who we're crowning as the next national champion, thanks to your committee and your work. Thanks again.
Appreciate it for having me on. Thanks, guys.